The Christmas Mystery, the 3rd of December. Like running before the wind, or like rushing down a moving staircase. Joachim woke up early on the morning of the 3rd of December. The Donald Duck clock that hung above his desk said 7:15, so there was still half an hour to go until Mama and Papa's usual waking time. He remembered that he'd dreamt about something strange, but he wasn't quite sure what. It had been something to do with the angel Ethereal and the lamb. He pulled himself up in bed and peered up at the magic advent calendar. At the top of the picture, several angels were floating down through the clouds in the sky. One of them was blowing a trumpet. That was to wake up all the sheep and the shepherds, of course. Joachim imagined that the angel on the right of the picture must be Ethereal. He was just as Joachim had thought Ethereal might look, and he was smiling at Joachim, raising an arm as if he was trying to wave. The angel seemed clearer than yesterday. Joachim got to his feet on the bed and opened the door with the number 3 on it. He saw a tiny little picture of a vintage car. He had seen that kind of old car once when he went to the Technical Museum with Grandpa. Joachim didn't understand what a vintage car could have to do with Christmas, but then he picked up a little piece of paper that had fallen out of the calendar and down onto his pillow. He snuggled down under the duvet and read what was written on the sheet. The second sheep. Elizabeth and the angel Ethereal ran on after the lamb. Soon they had left the wood behind and were going down to the narrow lane. In the distance, thick smoke was rising from some tall factory chimneys. "There's a town," said Elizabeth. "That's Halden," explained the angel. "We're quite close to Sweden." Suddenly, they heard a clatter right behind them. Elizabeth turned and saw an old car driving toward them. Driving the car was a man with a hat and a coat and a black beard who looked a little bit like the picture of Great-Grandpa on the mantelpiece at home. As he passed, the man sounded the horn and doffed his hat. "That car must be terribly old," exclaimed Elizabeth. "On the contrary, I think it was probably brand new," said Ethereal. "I always thought that angels were much cleverer than humans, but you don't seem to know much about cars," said Elizabeth, sighing in frustration. But she didn't want to argue with the angel, so she went on. "But I suppose you don't drive cars in heaven. I expect God has forbidden any kind of pollution." Ethereal tried hard to hide a laugh. He pointed to a pile of logs. "Sit down here," he said. "You deserve a short rest, and there's something important I have to tell you about our journey to Bethlehem." Elizabeth sat down and looked at the angel. "Don't you get tired too?" she asked. The angel shook his head. "No, angels don't get tired. We're not made of flesh and blood. It's flesh and blood that gets tired." Elizabeth felt a bit embarrassed. Of course angels didn't get tired. If they did, they wouldn't have the strength to fly up and down between heaven and earth. "Now, can you tell me exactly where we're going, my dear?" asked the angel. "To Bethlehem," replied Elizabeth. "And what are we going to do there?" "We're going to stroke the lamb, I suppose." The angel nodded. "And we'll also welcome the baby Jesus into the world. He was called God's lamb because he was just as kind and innocent as the little lamb's fleece is soft. We have to travel 2,000 years backwards in time to the moment when Jesus was born." Elizabeth put her hand to her mouth. "But isn't it impossible to travel backwards in time?" she asked. "Not at all," said Ethereal. "Nothing is impossible for God, and I am here as God's messenger. We have a small part of the journey behind us already. Down there you see Halden, and we have arrived back in the beginning of the 20th century. Do you understand?" "Oh, I think so," said Elizabeth, "and that means the car wasn't old after all." "No, it may have been brand new. I'm sure you noticed how proud the driver was when he sounded his horn. Not very many people owned cars then." Elizabeth simply sat and stared, and Ethereal continued. "Since you began running after the lamb, more than 50 years have gone by. We're running to Bethlehem through time, going downhill through history on a diagonal line. It's like running before the wind or rushing down a moving staircase. Elizabeth nodded. She wasn't sure she understood everything the angel was saying, but she knew how clever it all was. How do you know we're at the beginning of the 20th century? The angel raised his arm and pointed at the gold watch on his wrist, decorated with a row of shining pearls. On its face it said 1916. It's an angel watch, he explained. It isn't quite as accurate as other watches, but in heaven we're not too particular about all the hours and minutes. Why not? We have the whole eternity to see to, replied the angel, and anyway, we never have to catch a bus or get to work on time. Now Elizabeth understood why the church clock had only struck 3, even though it had been 6 or 7 o'clock when she ran from the shop, and why the snow had disappeared, and it had suddenly become summer. She had run backwards in time. You began running along the diagonal path as soon as you started chasing the lamb, continued the angel ethereal. That's when the long journey through time and space began. Another car approached them from the opposite direction, leaving a cloud of dust and sand behind him that made Elizabeth cough. When the dust cloud had settled, she pointed up at the road. There's our lamb again, but look, now there's a grown sheep as well. The angel nodded. Verily I say unto you, that sheep is going to Bethlehem too. And with that they began to run. When Elizabeth and Ethereal had caught up with the lamb and the sheep, both of them bounded on as well. Lambkin, lambkin, coaxed Elizabeth. But the lamb and the sheep would not be coaxed into standing still. They were going to Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. They passed the outskirts of Halden and paused for a moment to look down at the people walking in the streets and the markets. The ladies were wearing long, colourful cotton dresses and large hats in different colours. Several cars were sputtering along the streets, but there were horses and carriages as well. They left it behind them and soon came to a frontier station. A large signboard announced, Frontier, Sweden. Elizabeth was brought up short. Do you think we'll be allowed to go into Sweden? The angel fluttered around her like an overgrown butterfly. They won't dare to stop a pilgrimage, he replied. Besides, it's only a few weeks since Norway had the same king as Sweden. May I look at your watch again? Ethereal stretched out his arm. The watch said 1905. Then they sped past 2 frontier guards, the lamb and the sheep first, and Elizabeth and the angel Ethereal just behind them. Halt! Shouted the frontier guards, in the name of the law. But they were already far into Sweden, and they had come a few years closer to the birth of Jesus. Joachim sat up in bed, so that's why there was a picture of an old car in the advent calendar. That was why it was suddenly become summer too. Joachim made haste to lock the piece of paper with the story about Elizabeth and Ethereal into the secret box in case Mama and Papa came into the bedroom. Afterwards he sat for a long time thinking over what he had just read. Joachim was old enough to know that you can't really run backwards in time, but at least you can do it in your thoughts. At school he had heard that 1,000 years to mankind can seem like one single day to God, and the angel Ethereal had told Elizabeth that nothing is impossible for God. Could Elizabeth and the angel really have run backwards in time? Soon he heard Mama on the landing. She opened the door to his room and asked, Have you opened the advent calendar? He nodded, and Mama leaned over the calendar. A vintage car, she exclaimed. She sounded a bit surprised, almost disappointed. Perhaps she thought there ought to be pictures of angels and Christmassy things every day. It's because Elizabeth and the angel Ethereal have run to Sweden at the time when cars were like that and brand new, said Joachim. They're going to run all the way to Bethlehem. "I think you're a real little storyteller," replied Mama, patting him on the head. She went into the bathroom. Joachim felt a tickle in his tummy when he thought of all the clever things he knew that Mama and Papa believed he was just making up. He decided on something even more clever. On Christmas Eve, he'd put together all the pieces of paper that had come from the magic calendar and place the packet under the Christmas tree. Then he would write to the best Mama and Papa in the world on the outside of the packet. It was rather a pity he had this idea, because it made him look forward to Christmas even more, and though it was fun to have something to look forward to, it was boring having to wait so long. When Joachim looked forward to something exciting, it almost gave him a headache. That afternoon, Papa complained that he still hadn't found his driving license. In that case, he wasn't really allowed to drive, said Mama, but when Papa heard that, he snorted like a steam engine. That's the end of the chapter.